Okay, well, without further ado, Reverend Mitchell Moore, our Associate Pastor for Young Adults and Missions. Mitchell graduated with a Master's in Divinity from Covenant Theological Seminary in 2008. He has served in Indonesia, Memphis, Tennessee, and was actually the Director of Youth Ministry right here at First Pres 13 years ago. We all know Mitchell to be passionate as well as gifted as he serves in mission, discipleship, and shepherding. We are so fortunate to have him with us today and have him and his wife Lisa and their 4 children here with us at First Pres. Today he is sharing his thoughts with us on Just Mercy, written by Brian Stevenson. Mitchell?
I am very excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. Becca told me that I was a second choice, and I was very honored. It turns out the first choice was Brian Stevenson himself, and he's a little bit too much of a big deal. So I'm always happy when I can climb up the ranks and even become second choice. It's a real joy. And this is a great book. Has everybody in here read it? All right. Well, if you haven't read it, I'm going to give a pretty healthy summary. And almost all of what I'm saying is coming from the book, from my own heart. But I did look at a couple other book reviews just to kind of get some ideas for this. So something, justice and mercy, they're close to the heart of God's people, really of all humanity. We're created with a sense of needing justice. God reveals the foundation of his throne in Psalm 78 as justice, and love has said mercy. God commands his people in Genesis 18 to teach justice and righteousness, justice and mercy to all generations. Micah 6:8 compels God's people to seek justice and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. And so this subject is something that's close to the heart of humanity. It's close to the heart of God. And in fact, I think that they go very closely together. One of my favorite places, and I'm not going to preach, I'm just not going to do it. But Zacchaeus, when Zacchaeus encounters Jesus, he receives mercy, a completely unmerited gift of forgiveness and grace, a corrupt tax collector. And what is the first thing that he does? He shows mercy. He gives mercy to the poor. He pays back. He shows reparations, actually, to that which he stole. And so these two things go very closely together, not only in God's creative design, in God's revealed character, but in what it means to be a redeemed man or woman of God. Brian Stevenson, he's a lawyer, in case you don't know much about it. He's a social activist. He's obviously a best-selling author. He teaches at New York University Law School. But this book actually traces the origin story of him being the executive director of what is called the Equal Justice Initiative. The book itself, there may be a few of you like me sometimes, maybe you've watched the movie. It's been turned into a movie. And in fact, some big names in there. Michael B. Jordan and Jamie Foxx are in the movie. It's a good movie. And it mainly follows the main story of the book. And that is a case involving a man named Walter McMillan that we will talk about pretty thoroughly. He was a wrongfully accused African-American pulpwood worker. And his case was extremely controversial, and it really catapulted the work of EGI, the Equal Justice Initiative, onto the national stage. So McMillan's story is not the only one in the book. It is the one that the movie covers mainly, okay? So if you've seen the movie, you've read most of the book, but definitely you sell yourself short on that. So there's so many cases that are highlighted in the book, and it really reveals a major fault line in the American justice system. And it gives a ray of hope through documenting Bryan Stevenson's leadership and his work for more than 2 decades. And when you're first introduced to Bryan in the book, you realize he's an idealistic author, a lawyer, and he's extremely passionate for justice. But he finds himself caught up in a good old boy, Southern American legal system that is deeply rooted in bias and prejudice. It still favors the wealthy and the powerful over the poor and the helpless. And it's hard to not read many of these stories and find yourself despondent and discouraged. But the work of Bryan and his team, it really is like a ray of hope. It's like a light in the darkness. Bryan, a little bit about him, and it's in the book a little bit, but he went down from Harvard Law School. He had a good scholarship to that. He went down and worked in Atlanta with an organization called the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee. And that was where he first met a death row inmate, a guy named Henry. And it was very formative for Bryan. And I'm going to call him Bryan. I mean, I could call him Bryan Stevenson Esquire. I mean, what should I call him? You all okay with Bryan? Are we okay with that? Okay. It's just a lot easier, you know. He realized something when he worked with Henry. And that is, he didn't want to just fight against the death penalty. He wanted to actually reform the system. And he wanted to do this by creating an organization that's mission was to guarantee legal representation to every inmate that was on death row. Okay? And that's very different. So instead of fighting against the death penalty, he wanted to make sure every single person on death row had representation. And so Just Mercy contains a lot of stories of those that are either wrongfully or harshly convicted. It includes a story of a young woman who was on death row for writing 5 bad checks, no more than $150 each, right? And put on death row for that. Also, you'll encounter a 14-year-old boy who was protecting his mom against a violent boyfriend and took his life and was put on death row. That crime happened when he was 14 years old. My favorite story in the whole book, outside of Walter McMillan, it involves a guy named Avery Jenkins, and it really is tangential because I think it highlights a lot of the tension that you discover when you read the book. Jenkins is on death row because he has what is clearly and suggested mental illness. In Stevenson, Bryan finds that he was convicted for killing another man through repeated stabbings. It's a violent, horrible tragedy. But he goes to visit Jenkins, and on his way in, it's very clear that Bryan wants you to see, you might remember this image, the truck that was in the parking lot that had a Confederate flag on it, and it had some racist bumper stickers. Bryan takes some time to talk about how, since the post-Reconstruction era in the South, the Confederate pride is really held together, woven together, inseparably linked with violence in the subordination of African Americans. He wrote that ever since every small victory that African Americans have had in the South is met with an angry response, an increased political oppression that's sometimes violent. And you can't help but begin to sense the cultural tension. Being from the South, that's something that's very real for me. Like, not the Texas South, I'm from the real South, all right? Like, the real South doesn't have the option of getting unsweet tea. It's only sweet tea. That's where I'm from, all right? That's when you know you're in the real South. So I felt that tension as I read the book, and it's intensified when Bryan walks in to meet the client. Then this very large white man asks him to do a strip search. Actually commands him to do a strip search. And that's something that isn't ever done for attorneys. And then he makes sure that Brian, an African-American lawyer, knows that that truck outside was his. And the tension is palatable. And Stevenson goes in and he meets Avery, and Avery keeps asking him, do you remember the story? About a chocolate milkshake. I love this story. He tries to deal with issues of the case, and the man keeps asking about a chocolate milkshake. The story goes on, but they end up going to court, and Brian actually advocates for this man that he is mentally ill and should be treated with some sort of compassion and justice. And he begins to articulate Avery's story. And his past reveals that Avery had been in and out of foster homes, and that he suffered extreme abuse and extreme neglect, including a foster mother who would tie him to a tree and leave him there. And the argument was that the abuse and the neglect actually exacerbated the existing intellectual and emotional disabilities. And it led him, is that Jesus calling? Is it time to stop? Yeah. It led him as a teenager. He became homeless. He became abused to substances, and he had symptoms of psychosis. And in fact, when he was stabbing the man, he actually thought he was killing a demon. So worse than that is that when he was convicted, his lawyers offered no evidence regarding Avery's past or present mental state before he was sentenced to death. As the story goes, Stevenson was unable to bring him a milkshake, the chocolate milkshake that he kept asking about, every time he went to visit. The team at EJI arranged a post-conviction hearing for Avery. The sentence was lessened. He was able to go to a mental facility, and the mental health experts that testified really helped with that. They presented the evidence about Avery's former foster parents. In fact, those folks had actually been convicted, and they had evidence that even went into sexual abuse. And so that helped highlight the mental and emotional instability and illnesses that Avery had. But one reason why this is one of my favorite stories of the book is because the security guard that had been a very clear racist, that had treated Brian Stevenson completely without any dignity, forcing him to strip, he heard the testimony. He heard Stevenson's defense. And in a beautiful turn of events, he ended up telling Brian that he himself grew up in foster home. And he himself had experienced some of the same abuses. And you know, that's not uncommon, by the way, for children in foster homes to experience a level of abuse and neglect. It's why in our church, this is a side note, I'm going to step over here, but in our church we have a ministry called the Love Initiative, Loving Orphans Via Everyone. And we want to empower foster families, and we even work with families that are on the brink so they don't have to send their kids or grandkids into foster care. And so we have all kinds of information about that. It's even on the table right out there. We'd love for you to learn more. But the change of disposition of this security guard ends in a beautiful way. It's beautiful that the security guard, the white security guard that was against Brian, and because he was black and because he was a lawyer, ends up driving Avery to the mental institution, and he told Brian that he bought him a milkshake on his way. He actually gave him the chocolate milkshake that he continued to ask for, and every time Brian went to go see him after that, he never brought up the milkshake again. And I just think it's a beautiful picture of how familiarity and hearing one another's stories and actually getting to know each other can remove a lot of the existing hostility, a lot of the cultural barriers that are out there, and it compels us all to listen and hear stories and not judge, whether that's judging somebody by a bumper sticker or by their socioeconomic status or the color of their skin. However, the longest and most important story for all of Just Mercy is one I've already mentioned. It's that of Walter McMillan. Now, it centers around a murderer of Rhonda Morrison. And so Walter McMillan, he is described as someone who spent most of his childhood picking cotton. He managed to be a moderately successful businessman by the time he was 45 years old. He was also married at this time of the murder, and he had children. However, in the community, he was best known as the man that had an affair with a woman named Karen Kelly. And this was notable because she was a white woman. And in fact, his son had married a white woman as well. So he was most known for what was considered a very public transgression of interracial relationship in marriage in his family. On November 1st, 1986, a very beloved 18-year-old white dry cleaning clerk by the name of Rhonda Morrison was shot numerous times. They did not know who committed the crime. At the time, Walter McMillan was at a fish fry with his church. But that did not matter because the new mayor was a guy named Tom Tate. And he was openly racist, and he wasn't about to allow a case like this to remain open in the books. And so, after Ralph Myers, who himself was mentally unstable, and a friend of Karen Kelly, who was the white woman that had an affair with Walter, after that arbitrary implication, Walter McMillan was arrested. Now, it's important when you follow the case to note that not only did Walter McMillan say that he had never met Ralph Myers and therefore couldn't be identified when they tried to connect the two murders with him, but it was actually, or the murder of Rhonda Morrison with him, it was actually important to note that there was no evidence against McMillan. As you read the story, the only evidence that you can discover is that he was an African American man that was involved in an adulterous interracial affair. And they said, quote, that meant he was reckless and possibly dangerous, even if he had no prior criminal history and was otherwise had a good reputation. They invented evidence. The sheriff, the judges, everybody was in on it. Tom Tate, the district attorney, several investigators bribed witnesses. They forced Ralph Myers, the mentally unstable guy, to testify that McMillan was a murderer even after he tries to recant. They systematically ignored evidence of Walter being innocent. There were many witnesses, all of them African American, who swore under oath that at the time of the murder, McMillan was at the church fish fry. But in almost all white jury, there was one African American member there. They pronounced McMillan guilty and recommended a life sentence after a day and a half of trial. Not only that, but the judge, whose name was Robert E. Lee Key, using a unique Alabama practice called judge overrule, to override the jury and impose the death penalty that, after all, he had already put him to await on trial on death row, even before the defense could present its case. Here's how we know all of that. It's tragic. But we know it because Brian Stevenson and his team of EJI lawyers at Equal Justice Initiative, they took on this case. And they started finding all kinds of dirt, all kinds of things that they did not want revealed. The beginning of the investigation was finding stuff about Ralph Myers, the key witness. But it would take years for Myers to officially recant his testimony. They would discover proofs of bribery, different coercion methods that were used by the state to convict Walter in ways in which their racially motivated hatred had been messed up and entangled with all the evidence that they used. It wasn't until the case gained nationwide attention, it was on CBS's 60 Minutes, that the new DA, a guy named Tom Chapman, decided to launch his own investigation into the EJI claims of Walter's innocence. Because of this, the EJI was in a good position to move towards the state and ask them to drop charges against McMillan 6 years after he served on death row. He was finally released. But unfortunately, he did not live much longer. His anxiety that he had, the dementia that had set from his 6 years on death row and the trauma of all this case, he ended up dying just a few years after he was released. Brian Stevenson was able to speak at his funeral, and here are some things that he said. He said, "I felt the need to explain to people what Walter had taught me." This is what Stevenson wrote in Just Mercy. "Mercy is just when it's rooted in hopefulness and freely given. Mercy is the most empowering, liberating, and transformative when it is directed to the undeserving. The people who haven't earned it, who haven't even sought it, are the most meaningful recipients of our compassion." And I love this quote. He says, "Just mercy belongs to the undeserving." And if you're a Christian, you know that that resonates deeply. Just mercy belongs to the undeserving. It's the only thing strong enough to, quote, break the cycle of victimization and victimhood, retribution and suffering. It has the power to heal the psychic harm and injuries that lead to aggression and violence, the abuse of power, and mass incarceration. I have several key lessons that I took away from this book. First, there is a very biased mass incarceration. It's a serious problem in the United States of America. At present, 2.3 million people are in prison in the United States. 3 times that many, around 6 million, are on probation or parole. That makes just a staggering number of 8 million criminals that live on U.S. soil. Basically, it means that if you know, and I read this, I thought, oh, that's fascinating. If you know more than 40 people, then you definitely know someone who's a criminal, which is wild. How does that compare to other countries? We have 737 prisoners per 100,000 people. That puts us at the top of the list for the most incarcerated country in the world. And if you think about other countries that use policing as a form of enforcing totalitarianism, i.e. China and Russia, we don't want to be at the top of that list. All right? This is in the book. 1 in every 15 people born in the United States in 2001 was expected to go to jail or go to prison. 1 in every 3 black male babies born in this century is expected to be incarcerated. Here's what Stevenson says. "My work with the poor and the incarcerated has persuaded me that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. I've come to believe that the true measure of our commitment to justice, the character of our society, our commitment to the rule of law, to fairness and equity, cannot be measured by how we treat the rich, the powerful, the privileged, and the respected among us. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned." I love his line. He taps into the deep roots of humanity that we all have, and he says, each of us is more than the worst thing that we've ever done. It's a powerful line, and I can identify with that. Good news. He also makes a strong point that the death penalty is not about whether people deserve to die for the crimes that they commit. The real question of capital punishment in our country is the question, do we deserve to have the right to kill anyone? That's a pointed question that I think is worth wrestling. This book is worth reading if you haven't read it. It's worth sharing. If you're looking for identification points with generations that are younger than you, I recommend that you read this book and talk with kids, grandkids. If you're looking for identification points with people that aren't believers and that might have a distrust with the church or a hunger for justice, this is a great book to leverage conversation, to deepen connection, and to show that God's heart for justice still beats in the church today. We serve a God who says in Amos 5 that he hates injustice. And he commands his people to seek justice. And therefore, it's impossible for us to read a book like this and not be compelled to participate in God's work of seeking justice. It was a privilege and honor to read this. I'll confess I didn't read it for you all. I had already read the book, so when Becca tapped me as the number 2 choice, then I said I would love to do it. I'd love to do it. I wish Brian could have come. I would have loved to gather a lot of people. I'd love to bring him. We should bring him sometime. He does speak at churches. Okay. He spoke. You can listen to a few of his talks. Several Presbyterian churches actually. One in Michigan, one in Wisconsin. One of them is the Eco Church. He did some weekend things for them. He's extremely gifted, but he spends a lot of time promoting EJI because they're a nonprofit and they raise money. So thank you for the privilege. I'd already read the book, and so it was fun to put this together, to be reminded of it, and it was very helpful in something else that I'm teaching and leading next week. So thank you very much. Do I take questions? That's it.
Anybody have questions?
Yeah.
I heard you say, or use the word thread of justice. We see a thread of justice in this book. And yes, that's wonderful. And we see threads of justice when George Floyd was killed by that policeman. We see a thread of justice. But there's so much hate in our world today, and I'd like to see more than a thread of justice, as we all would.
Yeah, me too. I appreciate your heart, and I agree with you. And it seems that the thread of justice is actually being unraveled, and the whole fabric of society seems to be at risk. Yeah. Thank you for your heart. We need more love for sure. For sure. Robert, do you have any?
Well, total of 3 comments. First, the opposite of justice.
The opposite of poverty is justice.
Well, I don't know logically whether that also means that the opposite of justice is poverty, but I take it to mean that. And it's quite a progressive idea that that poverty is so often the result of unjust deprivation of opportunity and a lack of compassion and care for people or whatever. And so I think that's quite an astonishing idea. The second comment...
It definitely gets you thinking, doesn't it?
It does, it does. The second one is Monroeville, Alabama. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Walter is in Monroeville, and that's where the conviction takes place. And I think the author makes the point that Monroeville is the town in which To Kill a Mockingbird is set.
Atticus Finch, yes, that should be brought up. I didn't bring it up. I was focusing on the stories, but keep going.
But then the third comment related to that is how stories like of this, of extreme injustice, has sort of a false cathartic effect. People say, oh, well, yes, isn't that awful? But then seemingly much lesser forms of injustice are not so bad, and namely unconfessed or unconscious or ingrained prejudicial attitudes that we all have still, that we still have rid ourselves of prejudicial attitudes. So, and the vicious consequences of this prejudice lead some people to, as happened in Monroeville, it is absolutely horrifying. And then the final comment is one of the assistants of Brian Stevenson that comes down from Harvard Law School is staying on working, helping him in the case, and Brian is astonished to find that he's still in Alabama working hard, and he explains, well, you know, I find it intriguing to stay here in Alabama, and you know, in this horrible prejudicial problem of where there's little hope of overcoming that. I was graduated in the college class of '61, and one of my roommates was a New Yorker, Long Island and Manhattan, became a doctor, and nothing would do but he had to establish his practice in Birmingham, Alabama. So after reading this book and the comment about finding living in Alabama intriguing, I said, you know, you must have found it intriguing to live in Alabama, and I've been astonished all my life that you, a New Yorker, you know, just, he's been there all this 60 years.
Wow.
You know, since we graduated, you know,
Wow.
serving in the medical profession there. But it's really something, you know. I guess it's a place where you could work to make a difference, I guess, you know, so.
Thank you for those comments. And I want to highlight one thing that you said. It's easy to kind of overlook the smaller injustices of our hearts and lives that are really easy to justify when we see something that's this intense. And all of the larger injustices, by the way, they're made possible because of the silence and the unaccountable nature of all the smaller ones that become permissible.
But he, you know, it's shocking. He said that the people were proud of the To Kill a Mockingbird, and they were proud of having the movie being shot there, and you know they were well aware of the unjust accusation of the African American man in the story, and yet go right on.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's just incredible. You know, it's just.
Yeah, you know, Jeremiah 17 says that the human heart is deceitful above all things. And it is very clear sometimes when you hear things like this. So thank you for pointing that out. Any other questions, comments, or snide remarks? That's it.
I think prejudice happens in every state. We can't just blame it on Alabama or Mississippi or some of those little southern states. It's everywhere. And we all seem to put up with it.
Yes, ma'am. It's even here. I remember in college I was talking to my Spanish professor about Jesus. I had been a Christian for 3 years, and he was not a Christian, and he helpfully rebuked me in helping me see my subtle racism. And he wrote me a note and he signed it, El Dios se habla español también. God speaks Spanish too, right? And I had unintentionally, growing up in a white middle-class home, created God in my own image. And I was very grateful for that rebuke, and I carry that with me. You're right, it's even here, it's all over. And that's why the gospel is so powerful. Real justice satisfied on the cross, the mercy that we receive, is because we can freely acknowledge where our own heart's deceitful, first and foremost, so we can be a part of the healing and not the problem. Grace?
I think, yes, and it doesn't matter what state you're in, it's still our country. We still carry a responsibility for something that happens anywhere in the country. But the story that got me the most was the 14-year-old.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just one story after another after another.
Yeah.
But a 14-year-old, how does that happen? A minor, a 14-year-old, do people just not know it's happening and he's just there? I mean, how do people not know that? And he's not the only one. If there's one, there's two, there's three, there's a dozen, there's 100, there's 200. Yeah, I just, I felt terrible. I didn't know a thing about it. I mean, I never knew it. Never knew that was happening. Never knew a 14-year-old could end up on death row.
And that's unbelievable, just to have whole opportunity taken away. And there's a huge death row case that is going to be argued before the Supreme Court in the session. It involves the state of Texas, and maybe you've read a little bit about the pastor that wants to lay hands on death row man. And there is, I'll just say this in confidentiality, but there is a very close family connection. The person that's arguing that case on behalf of the state of Texas is very closely associated with our church. So it's it'll be a very high profile case. Any other questions or comments?
I'll just say, this was such an upsetting book to read, like you, Grace. Just some of this I just wasn't aware of. And as I read it, I kept thinking, maybe it's gotten better. Maybe there's a new generation of lawyers out there, sheriffs or DAs. Maybe with the way technology is today, with DNA, they can solve these cases better. But then I would look and I saw this wasn't written that long ago.
No.
And
That's
I
really
kept
disturbing,
thinking
isn't it?
there would be some glimmer, some hope.
Yeah.
And then it was a very upsetting book to read because it's probably still going on all around us.
You know, there's a large biblical category called lament, and it gives language for moments when we're facing difficult parts of our fallen world, unanswered questions of faith. And the Psalms of Lament, Psalm 13, 92, various other Psalms were really helpful for me when facing this kind of realities. Robert, you want to say something?
Yeah. So as I recall, and I didn't read the book as carefully as I might have, but is it true that they never did find who really did murder the man?
Yeah, I don't think it did.
But Brian, didn't he identify, somebody suspicious, but there was absolutely no
follow-up.
no will to follow up on that whatsoever. Total no cooperation, and he had no power to.
That's right. And that's why I say at the beginning of this review that Brian Stevenson was really up against a good old boy network.
Yeah.
I mean, it is who knows who and who went to high school, whose families know this. I mean, and that sort of thing is really hard to get justice because cover-up is pandemic. So, anybody else? Well, I want to thank you again for multiple things. Celebrating and cultivating a culture that reads and celebrates reading, yes, we need more. More and more, our country is becoming illiterate. People are not reading anything that's longer than 160 characters, what they can tweet, and you're just like, oh, come on, right? So thank you for cultivating that, and please let me know how to encourage you to do it more and more. Also, thank you for engaging an issue like this. I know it's not the most fun, right? It's not. I mean, we're all longing for that happy ending, and unfortunately, this is a story that's still being written. So thank you for engaging on that level. And finally, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share. We really value you all tremendously, and it's a joy for me to be here. So thank you for the invitation.